We are honored to be joined by Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett, who is Senior Advisor to the Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Program Director of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Program at Seton Hall University, one of our academic higher ed partners. Dr. Pritchett, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, for all the work that you do.
That's very kind of you. Listen, on this segment, we're going to feature three leaders, African-American leaders, who mattered greatly. Two of them are from New Jersey, part of our initiative called New Jersey Leaders Who Matter, Powering Equity and Social Justice. But let's start with arguably the most important African-American leader, one of the most important leaders in the history of our nation and the world, Dr. Martin Luther King. Your program is named after him. What would you say his greatest contribution to our country is?
Yes. I am not going to say it was his "I had a dream" speech at all, because most people only remember that about him. I attempt to make him, transform him from being a one-dimensional leader with that one fact, making him three-dimensional. I think his most important contribution was to appeal to the moral consciousness of America. He not only spoke to the civil rights of the Negro. Ultimately, he was talking about the rights of poor people. He even, in one of his quotes, gave us some insight to the events that had occurred even in Europe during the Nazi period, where one of his quotes was, "Everything that Hitler even did was legal." When you find that quote, you may say, what is he talking about? Well, you know, he gets even into history. So he was, I think, his presence was prophetic, not just civil rights and social activism, it was prophetic.
You know, and the "I Have a Dream" speech, talked about by many, revered by those of us who are in the world of communications. But I often think what Dr. King would think, but more importantly, the impact he would have today. Do you ever think about that?
By all means. As a matter of fact, that thought infuses everything that I attempt to do through the Martin Luther King Leadership Program at Seton Hall University. The university started that program in 1970 as a full scholarship to African-American students. In today's world, we offer 20 scholarships to students from around the world who have a vested interest, whether they're from Africa, Venezuela, or from Newark, who have can articulate strategies and plans for very specific social action, social justice projects. That's how we carry out the legacy.
Real quick, I'm sorry for interrupting, Doctor. Real quick on this, as a student of leadership, I often think about servant leadership, which you are, which you teach and coach and help your students understand that at the university. Dr. King was a servant leader.
Absolutely.
In the greatest sense.
Exactly. Even before we use the term servant
That's
leader.
Right.
Servant leader. I often would like to say that his model for leadership is actually the servant leadership of Jesus Christ, basically.
Let's talk about another leader who served with great distinction. Part of our New Jersey Leaders Who Matter, Powering Equity and Social Justice. You'll see the chyron come up at the bottom of the screen. State Senator Wynona Lipman, you know, being born and raised in Newark, as a Newark kid in the 70s, you could not come from Newark and not just know, but be proud of Senator Wynona Lipman, the first African-American woman to serve in the state Senate from 1972 to her death in 1999. Who was Senator Lipman and why did she matter so much?
She was a woman ahead of her time. When I look at her career, I think about something my grandmother said to me and probably said to her by her parents. That is, when you are being born into the America of the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, and when our parents and grandparents had either picked cotton and or saw how racism had ravaged our communities, had already killed off many of our men, what our parents would tell us is that it's not about keeping your head low. They said, but if you're going to get educated, for example, we think you have to have twice as much education as any white person out there to escape racism. So when I look at a Wynona Lipman, someone who has a PhD where she studied in French studied at the Sorbonne in Paris after starting at Columbia. That's the model that I often share with young people today. And some of them are thinking that's too much work. But if you're going to approach the field of inequity, so to speak, you are best, prepared, so to speak, in terms of your mindset as a leader, to penetrate it with excellence, do all that you can do. And I think she represents that model. And yes, sir.
She was a role model for so many others and was a real trailblazer.
Absolutely. The only woman ultimately in the state Senate. She demanded respect, not only in the context of her being, quote, a Negro as they were called at that time, but also being the only woman. So she represented that double jeopardy, so to speak. But she did it with excellence. I think somebody once called her the steel magnolia. That is, when you look at her, she was always dressed very refined.
Very classy.
Exactly. But when you stepped out of line, verbally or physically, she really brought it to bear as she would respond to you.
And by the way, before we talk about Gil Noble, the great broadcaster at WABC in New York, based here, his home was in New Jersey. And I believe, by the way, did you say he was from, I'm born and raised in Newark, but I live in Montclair now. Was he from Montclair?
To the best of my knowledge, as a married man, his residence was in Montclair, New Jersey.
Okay, by the way, I just want to say this about Senator Lipman. Being born and raised in Newark and Essex County, rough and tumble politics is not a cliche. Very rough, a lot of fighting.
Well said, well said.
Vicious, and Senator Lipman navigated that, negotiated that. Don't underestimate that. Gil Noble, for those of us in broadcasting, and growing up, you see Gil Noble at WABC. I mean, his program for so many years was the longest running public affairs program and made such a difference at a time when nobody was doing what he was doing. Talk about Gil Noble.
A giant in the field and a pioneer. By the way, Gil designed, at the height of his career, he designed and taught at Seton Hall in our Black Studies Center, a course called Media and Minorities.
While he was doing Like It Is?
That is correct. We teach that course to this very day, Media and Minorities. Gil wanted to get across what are the complexities of the media industry, but also how had media been used historically in America, in a sense, to be part of the platform for inequality toward Black folks. And another trivia fact, if you don't mind me mentioning, is State Senator Lipman was the chairman of the advisory board also for the Black Studies program at Seton Hall University in her private life. She even created a scholarship in the Black Studies program named after her son.
Let me ask you something. As you talk about Senator Lipman, as we talk about Gil Noble, who we'll talk about some more, and also there are no words for Dr. King that are enough or appropriate or do justice to him. Why do you think, Dr. Pritchett, it's so important for us to be doing what we are doing? And this is not to kiss up to us or what we're doing, but we decided to do this because we thought it was important to feature people of all different backgrounds, but particularly in the African American community in this program. Why do you think that's important, particularly now?
It is important because the issue of race, the issue of systemic racism is not going away. It's almost very cyclical. For example, if I were looking at my own life as a parallel, I'm born during World War II, the 1940s. My parents may have discovered by the late 50s that perhaps I was a bit too outspoken. So they, without telling me as a pre-teenager about the social consequences, all they did was, as a parent, tried to keep me a little bit more humble and keep my mouth shut more, because they really thought, without ever telling me, that can get a Black man into a lot of trouble. And matter of fact, it can cause your life.
That was then?
Yes, sir. So to answer this, the larger question is that what goes around, it seems to come around back on us again. The only difference between the 1940s and 50s, perhaps, and what has happened with George Floyd in the spring of, we'll say, 2020, is that we now have cell phones and cameras. What we said as eyewitnesses through our mouths, the world can see it through these cameras.
Yeah. And I want to thank you, Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett, for shedding light, for teaching us, for helping us understand what we need to understand, and not forgetting not only Dr. King, but also Senator Wynona Lipman and the great Gil Noble, who, for those of us in the world of broadcasting, his weekly public affairs series, Like It Is, must-see TV, a cliche, but so true for him. Thank you so much, Doctor. We appreciate it. We're honored by you joining us. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Steve. Keep up the good work with the caucus. Thank you.
Same to you. I'm Steve Adubato. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been a production of the Caucus Educational Corporation. Funding has been provided by PSC&G, the Turrell Fund, supporting Reimagine Childcare, PNC, Grow Up Great, New Jersey Sharing Network, the Healthcare Foundation of New Jersey, Summit Health, Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey, United Airlines, and by the Russell Berry Foundation. Promotional support provided by NJBIZ and by New Jersey Family Magazine.
New Jersey's early educators and childcare providers are more than twice as likely to live below the poverty line versus the general workforce. Reimagine Childcare, formed by a coalition in New Jersey, is dedicated to improving accessibility, affordability, and quality of childcare and reimagining the way we support these essential providers. Learn more by visiting reimaginechildcare.org.